So, Europe in the Dark Ages is the topic of the lecture. So, to start off, Europe in the Dark Ages did not have a centralized power. It did not really have a centralized power. When I say centralized power, what that means is like one person or one kingdom that was in charge of everything. So they didn't have a centralized power. You would instead say it was fragmented, or power was divided. Now, there's a reason for this. One of the biggest reasons is that in Europe, in, again, what would be called the Dark Ages, in the post-classical era, we pretty much say Europe was in the Dark Ages, and that's for Europe. It's not for Africa, it's not for the Middle East or China. Europe was in the Dark Ages. One of the biggest reasons for this was there was an ongoing conflict or an ongoing fight between the Pope, who was supposed to be just the religious power, and the Emperor. So, the Pope was supposed to be the person who was in charge of your spiritual power, basically in charge of the church organizing it, and the Emperor was supposed to be in charge of the political power or running the land, the laws. Well, they often conflicted and fought. And during most of this time period, post-classical era, Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, it's also called, Pope actually had more power. Pope had an army. More people would listen to the Pope than would listen to the Emperor. And because of that, there was never a large, unified empire in Europe, like there was in the Middle East with the Umayyad Caliphate, or with the Mongols, or with China during this time. So Europe was a divided place where you had a lot of small pieces of land, and the people who were ruling these small pieces of land were called nobles. This is probably going to look like a cactus, but this is supposed to be a castle. Yeah, it looks like a cactus, but that's a castle. So what you had was nobles would build castles on their land. They would own a small chunk of land, and they would have poor farmers who would work on this land. And those poor farmers would be called peasants. They were the poor farmers who were working the land. They would live on one pretty small chunk of land the whole time. They would farm it, they would live there, and they would die there. Notice a few of you aren't taking notes. What I'll do is I'll record your name down, and I'll just let you come in at lunch and I'll play this for you so you can take notes again. So you can either take notes now or you can take notes during lunch, whatever you prefer. So we'll continue. So a peasant, or a poor farmer, would likely live on this land all of his or her life and never even leave it. If they wanted to leave their land and visit somewhere else, they would need permission from the noble. So he would say, I want to go travel to my distant family, or I want to go to this other place. The noble would actually have to give permission. If the peasant did not get permission, they couldn't go. So your average person in Europe, stuck on one piece of land, would live there and die there their entire life. Not the best life. Yes?
What would happen if they left with
They could be punished by the noble. Could they be punished? Could they be imprisoned? Yes. Or their land that they're working on could be taken away, and they'd have no way to make a living. So, also nobles, when they took their land, they basically took it by force. and these peasants were forced to live on their land and follow their rules. Who are the people that would basically be backing up the noble or his military? We have a name for them. They were called the knights. So nobles would have armies of knights that would serve the noble. Now, how many of you, by a show of hands, when you hear the word knights, you think of maybe a good-looking guy with long hair who fights dragons and then saves women? All right, yes, you usually think of when we think of a knight. That's not the reality. Most knights were hired thugs. They were pretty much hired thugs who served the noble, and one of their big jobs was to basically terrorize the peasants so they would pay taxes and follow the noble on his land. The knights had another purpose, and so did the nobles with their castles. Again, that looks like a cactus there. The knights also had to defend against another group that would come in to areas and would steal a whole lot and then would leave. Who are we talking about? The Vikings. The knights would defend against the Vikings who would come in quite a bit. So nobles built their castles often as a defense against the Vikings, and the knights would be basically hired to fight against the Vikings as well. In 1 second. The other group that the nobles and their knights would fight against would be other nobles to try to get more land. So this noble might want to take land from this noble. If you're a peasant living here, you might find yourself 1 year living on this guy's land, and the next year living on another guy's land that was just taken over. Go ahead.
Okay, so but if you build a castle, wouldn't more Vikings want to come in the future?
Well, what they found with the Vikings was the Vikings would come in and would steal things, but the Vikings weren't very good at breaking over castle walls and fortifications. So over time, the Europeans figured out if they built castles and fortifications, the Vikings weren't very good. They wanted to come in quickly and take over. They weren't good at sieging it or surrounding it for a long time and then taking it over. So it's actually a pretty good defense against the Vikings. This would be an example of this picture you see right here of the castle. This one's actually located in northern England. That's called Alnwick Castle. That was built for defense against the Vikings at first. And I actually lived in that castle for 4 months when I was studying overseas in England. What's that? No, my junior year at St. Cloud State University, they have a program where you can go and study, live in a castle for 4 months, and you get 3 weeks of time to travel all around Europe. So I was 21, traveling around Europe, living in a castle. Got to go to Barcelona, Munich, Paris, London, a number of other cities. 21 years old at that time. And I'm not going to tell you half the stories. So let's move ahead. But it didn't cost hardly any more money because it was regular college money, the tuition that I paid to go. That's what I mean when you can study overseas. So anyway, that's one thing you can do when you get to college. And there are several Cristo Rey students who've already done that, who studied overseas for a semester. All right, let's continue. For the average peasant, the average European, there were many small wars going back and forth in battles, whether it was fighting Vikings, nobles fighting each other for land. There was limited education. Your average peasant was not being educated at all. They did not receive an education. They had to work the farms. The nobles got some education. Obviously, the king did as well. The economy was stagnant. Economy means jobs, the different kind of jobs there are. Now, in the Muslim world, if you went to a city, would there be a lot of different jobs you could do?
Yeah.
You could work in university. You could be a business person. You could start your own business. It'd be possible. In Europe at this time, not so much. There weren't many cities. So it was mostly a farming society where the peasants were doing the farming. Limited education, stagnant economy, not too many jobs. Again, probably not the place you want to live to go back in time 1,000 years. So, lastly, the Crusades begin, And the Crusades, if you want a quick definition, it's a holy war pretty much. The Crusades Begin, which is a holy war, trying to take what was seen as the Holy Land or Jerusalem. And 2 to 6 million Europeans die in the Crusades, going to fight for the Holy Land.
It's a big range.
It's a huge range, but they don't know exactly how many died because they didn't do a very good job of keeping track of the peasants, for example. It wasn't like there was a census back then. So we really don't know how many died. The estimates are between 2 and 6 million. More Christians die than Muslims during the Crusades. Part of the reason for that is because the Muslims had more organized military than the Christians did. Yes?
So the peasants fought too?
The peasants would often go, so would the knights, and some nobles, after a while, even led crusades. And why was this able to happen? Because the church had a lot of power. The Pope had a lot of influence in society at that time. So if the Pope said to go on a crusade, many people would follow the Pope. Good questions today. Go ahead.
Wait, so could the peasants escape? Like, if there's like could they escape?
Well, I tell you what, if I'm a peasant and I'm farming the land, and we're going to learn about this in our next video, and if the Pope says if you go and you fight in a crusade, all of your sins will be forgiven. Well, you might be like, am I going to stay here and farm on this land? Or will I travel and go fight, and if I die, I'm going straight to heaven? Which one sounds more appealing?
Farming.
Right? Yeah, I don't know. I might be sick of farming that land after a while. So many people do decide to go. I'm going to stop the video here, the recording, and I'll take some questions.